The primal fear of what lurks beneath the bed rarely fades with age, it merely learns to hide better in the daylight. For Olivia, seeking refuge from a life collapsing around her, an old rental house offered a veneer of quiet solitude. But solitude has sharp edges in the dark. Her familiar companion, stress-induced sleep paralysis, found fertile new ground in the creaking floorboards and shadowed corners. Soon, the chilling certainty would dawn. The paralyzing terror wasn't just in her head. Something ancient, skeletal, and territorial had claimed the space beneath her feet, and it waited patiently for 3 a.m. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The U-Haul groaned like a dying beast as Olivia wrestled the last box labeled kitchen crap onto the porch of the old rental house. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunbeams slanting through the wavy glass of the front window, illuminating peeling paint on the porch railing and the general air of dignified neglect. It wasn't the glossy, fresh start she'd pictured scrolling through Zillow listings after the double whammy of a layoff and a breakup that felt suspiciously like another layoff, but it was hers. Or at least, hers to rent for the foreseeable future. Cheap, isolated enough on the edge of town to promise quiet, and possessing a certain dilapidated charm she was trying hard to appreciate. Character, she muttered, hefting the box. It has character. And probably termites, judging by the soft spot near the threshold. Still, it beat crashing on her brother Marcus's couch indefinitely, fielding his well-meaning but ultimately useless advice. Here, she could lick her wounds in private, maybe even rediscover who she was when not defined by a job title or a relationship status. Unpacking was a blur of sweat, cardboard dust, and the constant, low symphony of the house settling around her. Floorboards creaked underfoot with unpredictable familiarity, drafts whispered from unseen gaps, and shadows pooled in corners with an intensity that seemed premature for the time of day. She knew about old houses, they had personalities, quirks. This one felt watchful. Or maybe that was just her own frayed nerves projecting onto the peeling floral wallpaper in the hallway. Olivia had always been a sensitive sleeper, prone to bouts of sleep paralysis during particularly stressful times. It was a terrifying but known devil, the sensation of waking mentally but being utterly unable to move, often accompanied by a crushing weight on her chest and the unnerving feeling of a presence just outside her field of vision. Usually, it faded within a minute or two, leaving her shaken but unharmed. She hoped the move, the forced change of pace, might actually lessen its frequency. A new bed, a new room, maybe a reset for her subconscious. She chose the larger upstairs bedroom, the one overlooking the overgrown backyard. It had decent light, a small closet, and surprisingly intact hardwood floors, albeit scarred and darkened with age. After assembling her second-hand bed frame and dragging the mattress upstairs, exhaustion finally claimed her. She didn't bother with sheets, just collapsed onto the bare mattress as twilight bled through the dusty window panes. The first night was predictably restless. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind rattling the old window frame seemed like a whisper. She drifted in and out of shallow sleep, acutely aware of the unfamiliar shapes and shadows in the room. Around what felt like the dead of night, the familiar, dreaded sensation began. Pressure. Heavy, suffocating, pinning her limbs to the mattress. Her eyes darted wildly in their sockets, the only part of her that obeyed. Panic clawed at her throat, silent screams trapped behind paralyzed vocal cords. The shadows in the room seemed deeper, coalescing into indistinct shapes that writhed just at the edge of her sight. It's the stress, she told herself, repeating the mantra that had always anchored her before. Moving day. New place. It's just stress. The air felt thick, heavy. Was that a shadow detaching itself from the darkness under the window? No, just her overtired brain playing tricks. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the pressure lifted. She gasped, sucking in air, limbs suddenly free but trembling. She didn't turn on the light, didn't want to see the empty room and confirm her fear was baseless, yet still feel the lingering dread. It was just sleep paralysis, she insisted silently. More intense than usual, yes, but explained. Definitely explained. A few nights passed in relative peace. Olivia established a tentative routine, unpacking boxes, cleaning decades of grime, applying for jobs online, forcing herself to explore the small town. The house's creaks and groans became background noise. She started sleeping better, convincing herself the first night's episode was a one-off, a product of extreme fatigue and anxiety. Then came the third night of the second week. She'd fallen asleep reading, the book sliding from her hand onto the floor beside the bed. Sleep came heavy and deep, until suddenly, it wasn't. Frozen. Instantly. The pressure slammed down, heavier than ever before, stealing her breath. Her eyes snapped open, staring at the textured ceiling, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the window. Panic surged, cold and electric. This felt different. Focused. Scratch. A faint sound, dry and brittle, like fingernails on rough wood. It seemed to come from below. Directly below the bed. Scratch. Scratch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the crushing stillness. She strained her ears. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate. Rhythmic. Coming from under the floorboards. Fear tightened its icy grip. She felt an overwhelming sense of presence emanating from the dark void beneath her bed frame. Something was there. Not just a feeling, but a certainty that prickled down her spine. Scratch. Scratch. Scrape. Her eyes, locked on the ceiling, felt tears welling, blurring the dim shapes above. She desperately tried to turn her head, to look towards the edge of the mattress, but her muscles refused. Then, in the absolute periphery of her vision, something moved in the sliver of space between the bottom of her hanging duvet and the floor. A flicker of movement. Long. Thin. Pale against the dark wood. Skeletal fingers. Joints like knots in old wood, tipped with ragged, broken nails. They emerged, slowly, tentatively, from beneath the bed skirt, twitching slightly as they reached. Just as a long, bone-white finger brushed the edge of the duvet, the paralysis shattered. Olivia screamed, scrambling backward on the mattress, kicking frantically at the covers, heart threatening to explode. She crab-walked until her back hit the headboard, eyes wide with terror, staring at the space under the bed. Silence. Darkness. Nothing. Her own ragged breathing filled the room. Sweat drenched her t-shirt. The book lay undisturbed on the floor where it had fallen. There was nothing there. Nothing but dust bunnies and shadows. It had to be a nightmare. The most vivid, terrifyingly specific nightmare she'd ever experienced, amplified by the sleep paralysis. It had to be. But as she sat there, trembling, refusing to lower her feet to the floor until the first hint of dawn touched the sky, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, lodged itself deep within her. The sound had felt too real. The sight too clear. Sleep became the enemy. Olivia started dreading the approach of night, the exhaustion pulling at her eyelids, warring with the stark terror of what awaited her in the dark. For the next week, the nightmare repeated itself with horrifying consistency. Not every single night, but often enough to shred her nerves. Always around 3 a.m., that liminal space the internet morbidly dubbed the witching hour, the paralysis would clamp down. The sequence was sickeningly familiar, the immobilizing pressure, the overwhelming sense of presence beneath her, and then the sound. Scratch. Scratch. Scrape. It seemed louder now, more insistent. Less like tentative exploration and more like digging. Or trying to widen a gap. The dry, brittle noise grated on her nerves even in memory, making the hairs on her arms stand up in broad daylight. And the hand. Each time, the glimpse felt clearer, less peripheral. Long, desiccated fingers the color of old parchment, stretched taut over sharp bone. Knuckles like strung beads. Nails broken and split, leaving faint trails in the thick dust under the bed, or was that just her imagination filling in the terrifying blanks? One night, she thought she saw more, the hint of a skeletal wrist, the suggestion of an arm attached, retreating back into the utter blackness beneath the frame just as the paralysis released her. She tried leaving the bedside lamp on, hoping the light would deter whatever her subconscious was conjuring. It seemed to help, slightly. The paralysis episodes felt shorter, the visual element less distinct, more shadowy. But the feeling of presence remained, a heavy weight in the room's atmosphere. And the sound, though perhaps muffled, still persisted, that dry, rhythmic scratching from beneath the floorboards. Exhaustion gnawed at her. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes. Her focus frayed during her job searches, her appetite dwindled. She jumped at every creak the old house made, her anxiety a constant, humming current beneath her skin. Was she losing her mind? Was the stress of her life situation finally cracking her psyche, manifesting as these hyper-realistic nocturnal terrors? Then came the morning she woke up feeling groggy but blessedly free from paralysis. She'd slept through the 3 a.m. window, a small victory. She swung her legs out of bed, feet hitting the cool wood floor, and froze. There, near the edge of the bed, illuminated by the morning sun slanting through the window, were marks. Faint, but undeniably present. Two thin, parallel lines, about 6 inches long, etched into the dark wood finish of the floorboards. They looked for all the world like scratches. As if something sharp, something with 2 points, had been dragged across the surface. Her breath hitched. She knelt, heart pounding, tracing the shallow grooves with a trembling finger. They hadn't been there before. She was sure they hadn't. She'd swept this floor meticulously just days ago. Splinters? Old damage she hadn't noticed? She ran her hand over them again. They felt fresh, the edges slightly rough against the smoother surrounding wood. Panic gave way to a desperate search for rational explanation. Maybe she'd done it herself? Tossed and turned violently, her own fingernails somehow scraping the floor from the bed? It seemed incredibly unlikely. She kept her nails short. And the angle was wrong. They looked like they originated from under the bed, moving outwards. Her eyes scanned the immediate area. Her phone charger cable, usually coiled neatly on the nightstand, lay partially on the floor. The book she'd finished reading 2 nights ago, which she'd left on the nightstand, was now lying spine up beside the bed leg. Small things. Easily explained by clumsiness in the dark, perhaps. But coupled with the scratches, and the memory of the nightmare hand. A chilling pattern began to emerge. Doubt warred with a rising tide of visceral fear. She needed an outside perspective. She needed Marcus. Her brother arrived that weekend, bearing pizza and his usual brand of slightly overbearing concern. He took one look at her pale face and the dark smudges under her eyes and frowned. "Liv, you look like hell. This fresh start looks more like stress continuation." Sitting at the rickety kitchen table, Olivia hesitantly recounted her experiences. She started with the sleep paralysis, framing it as an annoying resurgence of her old issue. Then, stumbling over the words, feeling foolish even as she spoke, she described the recurring nightmare, the specific sounds, the skeletal hand. Finally, she led him upstairs and showed him the scratches on the floor. Marcus listened patiently, his expression shifting from concern to skepticism, then back to concern. He knelt and examined the scratches, rubbing his thumb over them. "Okay, weird," he admitted. "But Liv, look. This house is ancient. Wood shrinks and expands, things shift. Could be old marks you just didn't see. Or maybe you dragged the bed frame slightly when you were making it? I haven't moved the frame, Marcus. And they weren't there before." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right. The nightmare stuff. That sounds intense. But you know you get sleep paralysis when you're stressed. And losing your job, the breakup, moving to this charming fixer-upper? That's textbook stress. Your brain is manifesting that fear, latching onto the creepy old house vibe. But the sound, Marcus. It's so specific. And the scratches. You could be acting out the dream," he suggested gently. "Sleepwalking, or just thrashing around. Maybe you knocked the book off, kicked the cable, scraped the floor with your own foot or something sharp on your nightstand without realizing it. It happens. People do strange things in their sleep." He put a hand on her shoulder. "I'm worried about you. Not because I think there's a monster under your bed, but because you're clearly not sleeping and you're terrified. Have you thought about seeing a sleep specialist? Or maybe just a therapist to talk through the stress? This place. Maybe it's not the best environment for you right now." His rational explanations sounded so reasonable, so sane. They were the same explanations she'd desperately tried to cling to herself. But standing there in the bedroom, the memory of those skeletal fingers reaching, the echo of the scratching sound seeming to vibrate faintly from the floorboards even now, Olivia felt a chilling certainty that Marcus, in his well-meaning skepticism, was wrong. Terribly wrong. The problem wasn't just in her head. It was under her feet. Marcus's visit, intended to soothe, only sharpened Olivia's resolve. His skepticism, while understandable, felt like a dismissal of the visceral reality she was experiencing nightly. If no one else would believe her, she would have to find proof. Undeniable proof. Her focus shifted from managing the fear to investigating its source. The space under her bed, and the floorboards beneath it, became an obsession. She started by emptying the bedroom completely. The bed frame was dismantled and moved against the wall, the mattress propped up beside it. She scrubbed the floorboards raw, examining every inch of the wood under the harsh glare of a utility lamp. Were there other scratches? Old nail heads? Deep splinters that could mimic the sound? She found plenty of imperfections, the scars of decades of use, but nothing that matched the distinct parallel marks near where the edge of her bed usually sat. And nothing that explained the sound. Next, she targeted the darkness itself. She bought the brightest nightlight she could find, a glaring LED monstrosity that bathed the room in a sterile white glow. Sleeping was even harder with the constant light, but she hoped it might act as a deterrent. As she'd noticed before, the paralysis episodes seemed slightly less intense under illumination, the horrifying visual of the hand remaining indistinct, a fleeting shadow rather than sharp bone. But the feeling of oppressive presence persisted. And faintly, just at the edge of hearing, sometimes obscured by the buzz of the nightlight itself, she could still perceive it. Scratch. Scratch. Emanating from below. Light didn't stop it. It just made it harder to see. Desperate, she turned to technology. She downloaded a sound-activated recording app onto her phone, propping it on the nightstand each night before attempting sleep, the microphone aimed towards the floor near the head of the bed. The first few nights yielded hours of silence, punctuated only by her own restless turning, the sigh of the wind outside, and the occasional groan of the old house settling, sounds she was learning to distinguish with painful acuity. She almost gave up, feeling foolish, paranoid. Then, on the fourth night of recording, she captured something. Playing back the audio the next morning, bleary-eyed and fueled by lukewarm coffee, she fast-forwarded to the timestamp around 3:07 a.m. Amidst the low hum of ambient noise, a new sound emerged. Faint, but unmistakable. Scratch. Scratch, scratch. Dry, brittle. Exactly as she remembered. But there was more. Interspersed with the scratching were faint, sharp clicking sounds. Like dry twigs snapping? Or bones clicking together? Followed by a low, almost inaudible sound that made the hair on her neck prickle, a soft, slow exhalation, like a dry, rattling sigh. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't her. She listened again, headphones pressed tight against her ears, volume cranked up. The sounds were clearly localized, seeming to come from directly beneath the phone's position, directly beneath where her head usually lay when she slept. Chills traced cold paths down her spine. This wasn't her imagination. This wasn't a dream. This was real sound, captured, objective. Her attention shifted from the space under the bed to the space below the floor. An old house like this. It had to have a crawl space, right? A shallow foundation, maybe? Where were the utilities? The pipes? She thought back to the house tour with the landlord, a quick, perfunctory walkthrough that hadn't included basements or attics. Her investigation became a hunt. She scanned the baseboards in every room, looking for vents or access panels. Nothing obvious. She checked the outside perimeter of the house, peering through the overgrown foundation plantings, finding only solid brickwork and a couple of small, screened vents near the ground, clogged with leaves and debris. Finally, inside the narrow linen closet off the main upstairs hallway, a space she'd barely glanced into, crammed with yellowed towels left by previous tenants, her fingers brushed against an irregularity on the floor, hidden beneath a threadbare runner rug. She pulled the rug back. There it was. A square outline in the wooden floorboards, distinct from the surrounding planks. A trapdoor. It was painted over, the edges sealed shut with layers of glossy white paint applied carelessly over the years. Two heavy-duty slide bolts, rusted and stiff, were fixed across the seam. Someone had wanted this space closed. And kept closed. She knelt, pressing her ear against the cool wood of the trapdoor. Silence. But she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, what lay directly beneath this door, beneath the hallway floor, and extending inevitably under her bedroom. The source of the scratching. The source of the clicking. The source of that dry, rattling sigh. The thought of opening it, of peering down into that darkness, filled her with a profound and primal dread. What kind of thing lived under a house? What kind of thing made sounds like that, and reached out with skeletal fingers in the dead of night? But the recordings on her phone were a stark reminder. Ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. It was there. Living. Breathing. Waiting. Directly beneath her. The trapdoor became a focal point of Olivia's fear and morbid curiosity. For 2 days, she alternated between avoiding the hallway closet entirely and standing before it, hand hovering over the rusted bolts, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The recordings played on a loop in her mind, scratch, click, sigh. Proof wasn't enough, she needed to see. She needed to understand what she was facing. Calling Marcus felt like admitting defeat, or worse, inviting his pitying rationalizations again, despite the audio evidence. This, she felt instinctively, was something she had to confront alone. At least initially. Gathering her courage, along with a putty knife, a hammer, and a heavy-duty flashlight she'd bought specifically for this purpose, she knelt before the trapdoor. The paint sealing the edges was thick, cracking like old porcelain as she carefully worked the putty knife into the seam, prying it bit by bit. It was slow, nerve-wracking work, each scrape of the knife sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Dust, smelling faintly acrid from the old paint, puffed into the air. The bolts were worse. Rusted nearly solid, they resisted her efforts, groaning in protest. She wedged the putty knife under one, tapping the handle gingerly with the hammer, trying to loosen its grip. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the first bolt slid back. The second was even more stubborn, requiring considerable force before it finally gave way with a jarring clang that echoed down the hallway. The trapdoor was free. Hesitantly, Olivia hooked her fingers under the edge, there was no handle, and pulled. It lifted slightly, then stuck. She pulled harder, bracing herself, and it swung upward with a groan of stiff, unseen hinges, resting open against the closet wall. A wave of air billowed up from the opening, hitting her face. It was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of packed earth, decaying wood, and something else. A dry, papery scent overlaid with a faint, musty odor that reminded her unsettlingly of old bones left too long in the sun. Bone dust. The phrase sprang, unbidden, into her mind. She coughed, waving the flashlight beam into the yawning darkness below. Wooden steps, steep and narrow, descended into blackness. Taking a deep breath, tasting the subterranean air, Olivia switched on the flashlight and started down. The beam cut a sharp cone through the oppressive dark, illuminating a low, cramped space. The ceiling, the underside of the hallway and bedroom floors, was only perhaps 4 feet high, forcing her to crouch uncomfortably. The ground was packed dirt, littered with fallen insulation, cobwebs thick as shrouds, and the detritus of decades past, rusted pipes snaking across the ceiling, brittle electrical wiring, a scattering of broken bricks, indefinable lumps of debris. She moved slowly, flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. The air was still and heavy. Her own breathing sounded harsh, amplified in the confined space. Initially, she saw nothing overtly sinister. Mouse droppings, desiccated insect husks, the silvery trails of slugs, patches of damp earth suggesting old leaks. Standard crawl space unpleasantness. She edged forward, navigating around support pillars and low-hanging pipes, trying to orient herself. Her bedroom should be directly ahead and slightly to the right. As she moved deeper, aiming the flashlight towards the area she estimated was directly beneath her bed, the beam landed on something different. The dirt floor here looked disturbed. Not randomly scattered, but almost raked, pushed into shallow mounds and depressions. And lying on the disturbed earth, half buried, were strange objects glinting dully in the light. Heart hammering, she crouched lower, shining the beam directly onto the area. It wasn't just disturbed dirt. It was arranged. Like some grotesque, primitive nest. Scraps of faded cloth, perhaps from old clothes or rags, were interwoven with clumps of filthy fiberglass insulation, dried leaves that must have blown in through foundation vents long ago, and brittle strands of what looked disturbingly like human hair. More scratch marks were visible here, not just faint lines on the floorboards above, which she could see from this angle, looking up, but deeper gouges scarring the thick wooden support beams and even the rough concrete of the foundation wall. Whatever made the sounds wasn't just scratching the floor, it was digging, marking its territory down here. And then she saw the objects woven into the nest itself, things that had no business being there. Small, milky white buttons, the kind found on old-fashioned children's clothing. A tarnished silver locket, chain broken. The delicate, brittle bones of small animals, birds, mice, maybe a cat. They were arranged almost deliberately, like perverse decorations. Her flashlight beam lingered on one particular object nestled amongst the debris. It was small, yellowish white, with a distinct shape. Rooted. Crowned. Unmistakably a tooth. Too large to be from any of the small animals whose bones littered the nest. It looked horrifyingly, undeniably human. Nausea surged, hot and acidic, in Olivia's throat. She scrambled backward, bumping her head on a low pipe, the flashlight beam dancing wildly. The nest. The scratching. The bones. The tooth. This wasn't just some animal seeking shelter. This was a lair. A den. Something had been living down here, directly beneath her bedroom, for a very, very long time. And it was collecting trophies. The cold, dusty air suddenly felt suffocating, charged with an ancient, predatory stillness. She had invaded its space. And now, it knew. Terror propelled Olivia up the narrow stairs and out of the crawl space. She slammed the trapdoor shut, the sound echoing hollowly, and fumbled with the rusted bolts, ramming them home with trembling hands. Leaning against the closed closet door, gasping for breath, the image of the nest, the bones, the hair, the tooth, burned behind her eyelids. The dry, dusty smell of the crawl space seemed to cling to her clothes, her skin. Rationalization was no longer an option. The physical evidence was too specific, too grotesque. This wasn't stress, it wasn't faulty wiring or settling foundations. It was something alive, something ancient and malevolent, residing quite literally beneath her feet. The need to understand, to know what it was, became paramount, eclipsing even her fear. Her first stop was the town's small, slightly musty library. She wasn't sure what she was looking for: property records, local histories, old newspapers. She explained to the kindly, gray-haired librarian that she was researching the history of her rental house, curious about its past occupants. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, seemed pleased by the interest. "Oh, the old Henderson place?" she'd said, peering over her spectacles. "Has quite a bit of history, that one. Not all of it pleasant, mind you." Mrs. Gable directed her to the local archives section, bound volumes of the town newspaper, property deeds, and a collection of oral histories compiled decades ago. Olivia spent hours hunched over brittle, yellowed pages, the scent of old paper mingling unpleasantly with the phantom smell of crawlspace dust in her nostrils. She started with the property deeds, tracing the ownership back through the decades. Hendersons, Millers, Cartwrights. Families came and went. Then she cross-referenced the names with the newspaper archives, scanning microfiche until her eyes burned. Advertisements, social notices, obituaries. And then, buried in the police blotter section from the 1970s, concern for welfare. Police responded to the residents at 14 Willow Lane, the old Henderson place, after neighbors reported hearing unusual noises and distress. Occupant, Ms. Eleanor Ainsworth, reported experiencing severe nightmares and claimed something was scratching beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. No signs of forced entry or foul play were found. Ms. Ainsworth moved out shortly thereafter. Olivia's blood ran cold. Scratching beneath the floorboards. The master bedroom, her bedroom. It wasn't just her. She kept digging. An article from 1952 mentioned the brief tenancy of the Miller family, who left abruptly after only 6 months, citing persistent unease and unexplained disturbances, particularly at night. No specifics, but the pattern was chilling. Then, in a fragile, typewritten volume of local folklore and oral histories collected in the 1960s, she found it. Under a section titled Things That Go Bump, nestled between tales of swamp lights and phantom coaches, was an entry about Old Scratch, or sometimes the Floorboard Man. The account, compiled from interviews with elderly residents, described a creature rarely seen but often heard. It was said to inhabit the dark, forgotten spaces beneath old houses, particularly those built on certain tracts of land near the creek. Descriptions varied, but recurring elements painted a terrifying picture: skeletal, unnaturally thin and tall when unfolded, desiccated like a mummy, moving with a slow, joint-popping gait. It was drawn to sleeping victims, particularly those troubled or afraid, feeding, some whispered, on their fear itself. Its presence was marked by inexplicable cold spots, a dry, dusty smell, and most distinctively, the sound of scratching, dry, persistent scratching, from beneath floorboards or within walls. Some tales claimed it collected small, lost things. Buttons, dropped coins, shiny trinkets. Tokens of the lives lived above its subterranean domain. One particularly chilling anecdote mentioned a child, little Timmy Cartwright, who disappeared from his bed in the house on Willow Lane back in the 1930s. Never found. The official story was that he wandered off, but hushed whispers persisted, linking his disappearance to the scratching sounds the family had complained about for weeks prior. Old Scratch. The Floorboard Man. The name resonated with a dreadful sense of recognition. The description matched the fragmented glimpses from her nightmares, the sounds matched her recordings, the behavior matched the history of the house. This wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. The folklore painted it as something more physical, more akin to a ghoul or a boogeyman, a creature adapted to the darkness, ancient and territorial. She needed to show Marcus. Not just tell him, but show him. The audio recordings, the newspaper clippings, the folklore entry, they painted a compelling picture, but the crawl space held the undeniable proof. She called him, her voice tight with a mixture of terror and grim validation. "Marcus, you need to come back. Now. And bring a good flashlight and maybe a crowbar." He arrived looking wary, clearly expecting another plea based on nightmares. Olivia didn't waste time. She laid out the articles, the folklore book open to the relevant page, and played him the audio recording, watching his face change from skepticism to unease, then dawning horror as the scratching and clicking filled the kitchen. "Okay," he breathed, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Okay, that's not the house settling." "No," Olivia said grimly. "It's not. And there's more. Something you need to see." Despite his obvious reluctance, Marcus followed her to the hallway closet. The air still felt heavy around the trapdoor. Armed with flashlights, they descended into the crawl space. Olivia led him directly to the nest beneath her bedroom. Marcus shone his powerful beam onto the disturbed earth, the scattered debris, the small bones. He swore under his breath. "What the hell is this?" It's a nest, Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly. It's nest. Then, Marcus's flashlight beam landed on something Olivia hadn't noticed before, tucked deeper into the disgusting tangle of insulation and cloth. It was a small, tarnished silver object. He carefully reached in, using the end of his crowbar to hook it out. It was the locket she'd glimpsed earlier, but now, seeing it properly, she recognized the intricate floral engraving on the front. It was identical to the locket worn by Eleanor Ainsworth in a faded photograph accompanying the 1970s newspaper article Olivia had found, the woman who reported scratching beneath the floorboards before fleeing the house. Marcus stared from the locket in his hand to the picture Olivia held out, his face pale in the flashlight's glare. The last vestiges of his skepticism crumbled, replaced by stark, undisguised fear. "Oh my God, Liv," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's real. It's actually real." The cold, damp air of the crawl space seemed to press in on them, thick with the presence of something ancient, patient, and deeply disturbed by their intrusion. Old Scratch was real. And they were standing in its home. Invading its nest was like kicking a hornet's den. The entity, Old Scratch, the floorboard creeper, whatever it was, shed any pretense of subtlety. Its presence, once primarily confined to the 3 a.m. witching hour in the space directly beneath Olivia's bed, now seemed to bleed into the rest of the house, the rest of the day. The rules had changed. It knew they knew. And it was angry. The scratching sounds were no longer confined to the dead of night. Olivia would be sitting at the kitchen table, trying to focus on a job application, and hear it, faint but distinct, scratch, scratch, seeming to come from the floorboards beneath her chair. Or she'd be washing dishes, and a dry, clicking rustle would emanate from within the wall behind the sink. It was mapping the house, or perhaps it had always had access, moving silently through the hidden arteries of the old structure, wall cavities, ventilation shafts, the crawl space network. The cold drafts intensified dramatically, especially near her bedroom. Even with the windows closed, icy air would snake up from the gaps between the floorboards or whisper out of the heating vent, carrying that faint, dry, dusty smell that now instantly triggered Olivia's fight or flight response. Simply being in the bedroom felt like standing on the edge of a freezer. She started sleeping on the lumpy couch downstairs, but the sounds followed her, scratching faintly beneath the living room floor, a constant, unnerving reminder that distance within the house meant nothing. The feeling of being watched became suffocating, omnipresent. Shadows seemed to linger too long in doorways, peripheral vision catching flickers of movement that vanished when she turned her head. More than once, she whipped around, absolutely convinced someone was standing right behind her, only to find empty air thick with a chilling stillness. Then came the near physical encounters, blurring the already thin line between psychological torment and tangible threat. One evening, curled up miserably on the couch trying to watch a movie, she felt it, a distinct, deliberate tug on the blanket covering her feet. Gentle, but firm. She yelped, kicking out, eyes darting to the floor. Nothing. Just the worn floral pattern of the rug. But the blanket had moved. She wasn't asleep, wasn't paralyzed. It had reached for her while she was awake. A few nights later, sleeping fitfully on the couch again, she woke abruptly to a sharp, stinging pain on her calf. She sat bolt upright, heart pounding, fumbling for the lamp switch. In the sudden glare, she saw them, two deep, parallel scratch marks, angry red against her pale skin, already welling with tiny beads of blood. They were longer, deeper than the ones on the floor upstairs. There was nothing near the couch she could have possibly scratched herself on so severely. It had touched her. Marked her. Panic escalated into desperation. Olivia and Marcus, now united in terror and grim purpose, tried frantically to secure the house, to ward off the entity. Their first act was to reinforce the crawl space hatch. They screwed heavy-duty plywood over the trapdoor itself, then dragged an old, heavy chest of drawers from another room to block it completely. If it couldn't get out that way. They consulted the folklore entry again. Salt? Some old traditions claimed salt lines deterred evil spirits or creatures. They bought huge containers of coarse sea salt, laying thick barriers across every threshold, every windowsill, and in a wide circle around Olivia's bed upstairs, though she refused to sleep there, and the couch downstairs. Light seemed to bother it, or at least inhibit its full manifestation. They left every single light in the house burning, day and night, running up an astronomical electricity bill but hoping the constant illumination would create a sanctuary. They stuffed towels and rags under doors to block drafts, taped over vents. They even tried blocking the space under the actual bed frame upstairs with stacks of books and storage boxes, creating a solid barrier. These measures didn't deter the entity. They enraged it. The activity shifted from stealthy harassment to outright aggression. Loud bangs would erupt from beneath the floorboards, shaking the room, sometimes sounding like heavy furniture being dragged across the dirt below. Objects left unattended weren't just displaced, they were thrown. Olivia walked into the kitchen to find a coffee mug shattered against the wall. Marcus went upstairs to retrieve something and found Olivia's carefully stacked books swept violently from the nightstand. The salt lines remained undisturbed, but the air within the house grew heavier, colder, charged with a palpable malevolence. The lights stayed on, but shadows seemed to deepen in defiance, and the scratching within the walls became frantic, incessant, like something trapped and furious, tearing at its confines. They were trapped with it. Sealing the crawl space hadn't contained it, it had merely confirmed its presence throughout the house's hidden skeleton. The warding attempts were useless. Old Scratch wasn't a ghost to be banished by salt or light, it was a physical creature, deeply rooted in the structure, and they had trespassed, threatened its territory, and now earned its full, terrifying attention. The slow burn of dread had ignited into a wildfire of fear. They both knew, with sickening certainty, that a confrontation was inevitable. It was no longer content to scratch and scare from the shadows. It wanted them out. Or it wanted in. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on Olivia and Marcus as they sat huddled together on the living room couch. Sleep had become a fragmented, fearful state, snatched in tense, hour-long increments. Every creak of the house was an incoming attack, every shadow a potential manifestation. They'd debated leaving, fleeing the house in the middle of the night, but a terrifying thought held them captive. What if it was tied to Olivia, not just the house? What if it followed? The folklore was ambiguous. And leaving felt like letting it win, leaving it to potentially harm someone else. Besides, where would they even go in their current state? The digital clock on the cable box glowed malevolently, 2:58 a.m. The air in the room was unnaturally cold, despite the lights blazing. A deep silence had fallen over the house, more unnerving than the previous bangs and scratches. It was the silence of held breath, of imminent action. Olivia clutched a heavy fireplace poker, its weight cold and unfamiliar in her sweaty palm. Marcus held the crowbar they'd used in the crawl space, his knuckles white. They stared towards the hallway leading upstairs, towards the sealed-off bedroom, though they knew the threat wasn't confined there anymore. 2:59 a.m. A faint scratching sound began, seemingly coming from the floor directly beneath their feet. Slow. Deliberate. Scratch. Scrape. Scratch. 3 a.m. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, thick and expectant. Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs. Her breath hitched in her throat. Then, from the hallway leading upstairs, came a sound that wasn't a scratch. It was a faint, dry click. Followed by another. Click. Click. Like bones settling into place. Or joints popping. Slowly, agonizingly, a shadow began to detach itself from the deeper darkness at the far end of the hallway, near the base of the stairs. It wasn't moving from the stairs, but rather emerging from the wall beside them? Or perhaps from the floor itself? A hand appeared first, creeping into the dim light spilling from the living room. Long, skeletal fingers, parchment pale skin stretched taut over bone, ending in ragged, dark nails. It pressed flat against the floorboards, testing, then began to pull. An arm followed, impossibly thin, joints knobbed and prominent. It moved with an unnatural, jerky slowness, yet seemed fluid, like an insect unfolding. Click. Scrape. Then, the head. Rising slowly from the floor level as if pushing itself up from below. It was desiccated, skull-like, tightly wrapped skin clinging to sharp cheekbones and a jutting jaw. Empty sockets, darker than the surrounding shadows, fixed unseeingly in their direction. A few brittle strands of dark hair clung to the scalp. Its mouth opened slightly, a black, silent slit, releasing a faint puff of that dry, dusty air. It paused, half emerged, its skeletal torso now visible. It seemed to be listening, sensing their presence. Its movements were terrifyingly silent except for the dry clicks of its joints and the faint scrape of its bones against the floor. Its goal seemed horrifyingly simple, to reach them. Terror rooted Olivia to the spot, the poker feeling uselessly heavy in her hand. Marcus made a choked sound beside her. The creature shifted, its empty gaze locking onto them, and began to drag itself forward, pulling its lower half, thin, skeletal legs ending in claw-like feet, from whatever void it had emerged from. It moved low to the ground, like a desiccated spider, its joints clicking with each agonizingly slow movement. The paralysis of fear broke. "Get back," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking, hefting the crowbar. The creature paused, head tilting slightly at the sound. Olivia reacted on pure instinct. Recalling the folklore, the aversion to light, she scrambled sideways, grabbing the heavy table lamp off the end table. Its cord ripped from the wall socket as she swung it like a club, aiming the bright, bare bulb directly at the entity's face. Hiss. A sound like dry leaves crushed underfoot, sharp and sibilant, erupted from the creature. It recoiled violently, skeletal hands flailing up to shield its empty sockets from the sudden glare. The direct light seemed to cause it genuine pain, making its desiccated skin smoke faintly where the beam hit strongest. The light! Olivia screamed. It hates the light. Marcus surged forward, crowbar raised, not to strike, but to create a barrier, shouting wordlessly, channeling fear into aggression. The creature, momentarily blinded and disoriented by the lamp Olivia kept trained on its face, hesitated. It hissed again, a dry, rattling sound deep in its chest, and began to retreat, dragging itself backward with surprising speed, joints clicking furiously. It didn't disappear back the way it came. Instead, it scuttled sideways, towards the wall dividing the living room from the dining room, and seemed to flatten itself against the baseboard. For a horrifying moment, it looked like it might try to squeeze through the solid wall. Then, with a final, dry scrape, it flowed downwards, seeming to melt into the floorboards, disappearing beneath the surface as if the wood had turned momentarily liquid. Silence crashed back into the room, broken only by Olivia and Marcus's ragged, desperate gasps. The lamp cast harsh shadows, illuminating the empty space where the creature had been. The air still felt freezing cold, thick with the residual dust and the lingering aura of ancient malice. They had fought it off. They had found a weakness. But as the first, pale hints of dawn began to filter through the edges of the curtains, the victory felt terrifyingly fragile. It hadn't been destroyed. It had merely retreated. Back into the walls, back beneath the floors. Waiting. The rising sun did little to dispel the chilling residue of the night's confrontation. The image of the skeletal creature recoiling from the light, melting back into the fabric of the house, was seared into Olivia's mind. They hadn't won, they'd survived a single battle in a war they couldn't possibly win. The house wasn't just haunted, it was infested by something ancient and physical, woven into its very structure. There was no discussion, no debate. As soon as the sun was fully up, casting long, deceptively cheerful shadows across the living room floor, they started packing. Not carefully, not methodically, but frantically, throwing clothes and essentials into suitcases and garbage bags, driven by a primal need to escape the contaminated space. Every creak of the floorboards, every settling groan of the old house, sent fresh waves of adrenaline through them. They didn't dare go back into the crawl space, didn't dare investigate the walls where it had retreated. They just needed out. They didn't even bother calling the landlord. They simply loaded Marcus's car, leaving behind furniture, boxes, the remnants of Olivia's failed attempt at a fresh start. As Olivia locked the front door for the last time, her hand trembled so violently she could barely turn the key. The house seemed to watch them go, its windows like empty eyes, holding its secrets and its occupant within. Getting into the car, she didn't look back. They drove for hours, putting as much distance between themselves and Willow Lane as possible, the silence in the car thick with unspoken trauma. Marcus eventually took her back to his cramped apartment, a space that now felt like a sanctuary. Weeks turned into months. Olivia found a new job, a tiny studio apartment in a modern, characterless building on the other side of the state. She saw a therapist, trying to unpack the trauma, though she carefully omitted the more unbelievable details, framing it as severe anxiety and sleep disturbances triggered by the old house. Sleep remained difficult, punctuated by nightmares, though the specific, paralyzing horror of 3 a.m. seemed to have stayed behind. She bought blackout curtains, slept with multiple lights on, and ensured her bed frame sat directly on the floor, no space beneath. She avoided old houses, folklore websites, and horror movies. She was rebuilding, slowly, painfully. Life was regaining a semblance of fragile normalcy. One crisp autumn morning, several months after the escape, Olivia was getting ready for work. The sun streamed through her apartment window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, normal dust, not the dry, ancient kind she remembered with a shudder. She stepped out of the shower, wrapping herself in a towel, and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the steamed-up mirror. She paused, wiping the condensation away with her hand. On her ankle, just above the bone, were two faint, thin, parallel lines. Pinkish red against her skin, as if freshly made. Scratches. Her blood ran cold. She leaned closer, heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. They were identical to the marks she'd found on the floorboards of that cursed bedroom. Identical to the ones that had appeared on her leg that terrifying night on the couch. She hadn't scratched herself. There was nothing in her bed, nothing in the shower, that could have made marks like that. She hadn't felt anything. She hadn't had the nightmare, Hadn't experienced the paralysis, not for months. But the marks were there. Faint, but undeniable. A wave of nausea washed over her. Had a piece of it broken off? A sliver of bone, a fragment of nail, embedded in her skin during the struggle, unnoticed until now? Or was it something worse? Was the connection not just to the house, but to her? Had it marked her, claimed her in some unseen way? She stood frozen, staring at the scratches in the mirror, the sounds echoing phantomly in her memory: scratch, click, hiss. The fragile normalcy she had so carefully constructed shattered around her. It hadn't stayed behind. It hadn't let go. It was still connected, somehow, waiting patiently. Waiting for her guard to drop. Waiting, perhaps, for the next time she found herself vulnerable, asleep, alone in the dark. Waiting for 3 a.m., wherever she might be. The reflection stared back, eyes wide with a terror that daylight could no longer disinfect. The thing that crawled out from under the bed wasn't just under the bed anymore. It was under her skin. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.